We're still covering the breaking news on Capitol Hill today. Some of us still picking our jaws up off the floor from what we have witnessed. Let me reset the day's dramatic events for anyone just joining the coverage. Attorney General William Barr was on Capitol Hill all day, testifying before the Republican-led Senate Judiciary Committee on the Mueller report. That testimony commenced this morning, just hours after explosive reporting broke in the Washington Post and the New York Times about a rift between Special Counsel Robert Mueller and Attorney General Barr over Mueller's concerns that the Attorney General had mischaracterized the special counsel's findings. That rift revealed in two never-before-reported letters written by Robert Mueller to William Barr. The second of those letters, sent by Mueller, reads in part, quote, "The summary letter the department sent to Congress and released to the public late in the afternoon of March 24th did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions. We communicated that concern to the department on the morning of March 25th. There is now public confusion about critical aspects of the results of our investigation. This threatens to undermine a central purpose for which the department appointed the special counsel, to assure full public confidence in the outcome of the investigations." Mueller also asked for Barr to immediately release more of the report executive summaries the special counsel's team had prepared for public release. Barr declined to do so. Today, Barr had to answer for accusations that he worked to skew the narrative in Trump's favor by announcing a decision on obstruction weeks before he released the full body of evidence, which turned out to be much more damning than Barr suggested. This exchange with Democratic Senator Chris Coons underscores the conflict.
I made it clear in the March 24th letter that Bob Mueller didn't make a decision, but that he felt he could not exonerate the president.
That's right.
I wasn't hiding the ball. From the public interest standpoint, I felt there should be only one thing issued, and it should be the complete report, as complete as it could be.
You somehow concluded the president didn't obstruct justice, and you announced that you had cleared the president 25 days before the public could read the Mueller report for themselves. I think it's no wonder Special Counsel Mueller thought your 4-page letter created public confusion about critical aspects of the results of the investigation, and that threatened to undermine the central purpose for which he was appointed.
And remarkably, when pressed by Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, Barr making another stunning declaration, saying he did not exonerate the president.
You, in effect, exonerated or cleared the president.
No, I didn't exonerate. I said that we did not believe that there was sufficient evidence to establish an obstruction offense, which is the job of the Justice Department. And the job of the Justice Department is now over. That determines whether or not there's a crime. The report is now in the hands of the American people. Everyone can decide for themselves. There's an election in 18 months. That's a very democratic process. But we're out of it. And we have to stop using the criminal justice process as a political weapon.
Let's jump right in with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us at the table, Matthew Miller, a former chief spokesman of the Department of Justice, NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman. Both Joyce Vance and Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorneys, are with us, and Mike Schmidt, Washington correspondent for the New York Times and national security reporter for the Washington Post, Matt Zapotosky, join us. John Heilman, I have not heard from you all day long, and I want to ask you to start where that sound ended, where Barr is saying, I mean, it's sort of like watching The Princess Bride. Like, up is down and down is up and purple is green and blue is red and the floor is the ceiling and the ceiling is floor. I mean, what was that today?
I'm surrounded by great legal analysts, people of great probity and analytic and sobriety and judgment. I have none of those things. I will say.
Me neither.
I watched a lot of today, and I was throughout the day. I kept thinking about Bob Kerrey, who once said that Bill Clinton was an unusually good liar. Like, Bill Barr is an unusually bad liar. he lied a lot today, and he lied in ways that were large and lied in ways that were small. I think lie is the only right word. You know, we now have, and there's been all over the place, instances of testimony that he'd previously given to Chris Van Hollen, to Charlie Crist on previous occasions up on Capitol Hill that now seems to have been utterly blown out of the water by the existence of these letters from Bob Mueller. He'd been asked if he knows whether Bob Mueller supports his characterization of the report. He says, I think he does, or I don't know that he doesn't, when in fact he knew. When Crist questioned him previously, he said, you know, did he know what the press reports were about when there was press reports that said that some of Mueller's people were upset about his characterization of the Mueller report? He said, I don't know what that's referencing. You know, how much more glaring can the inconsistency be? And today, throughout, over and over again, he said things that were, yes, Alice in Wonderland, up and down is up, but also things that on the bare reading of the timeline, I believe don't stand up today and will be exposed to be gratuitous, glaring, screaming, flagrant lies over the course of the next few weeks.
Just on the timeline, what he said to Charlie Crist, that he had no knowledge of Mueller being upset,
or frustrated,
was something that he said after he received a letter that he today described as snitty.
Yes.
So he had found Mueller to be snitty, but he testified. So we also know that he lies with ease to Congress.
Yeah, and I know that you guys were just discussing in the last 15 minutes of the last hour the characterization of the call, where he claims that Bob Mueller is concerned about the press coverage of the thing, just seems on its face utterly implausible, given what we know, what's in the letter, given what we know about Bob Mueller, given what we know about the nature of what has occurred over the course of the last nearly 2 years in American life around this subject. It seems to me the notion that Bob Mueller was saying, you know what, I was watching Fox News the other night, and the way Hannity talked about this was not that great. I'd like to clear it up. It just rings utterly hollow and, as I said before, like glaringly false.
One of the big moments today came from Kamala Harris. Let's play that.
Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone?
I wouldn't.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat that question?
I will repeat it.
Yeah.
Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone? Yes or no, please, sir?
The president or anybody else?
Seems you would remember something like that and be able to tell us.
Yeah, but I'm trying to grapple with the word suggest. I mean, there have been discussions of matters out there that they have not asked me to open an investigation, but
Perhaps they've suggested,
I don't know. I wouldn't say suggest.
hinted,
I don't know.
inferred. You don't know. Okay. In reaching your conclusion, did you personally review all of the underlying evidence?
No, we took and accepted. We accepted.
Mr. Rosenstein?
No, we accepted the statements in the report as the factual record. We did not go underneath it to see whether or not they were accurate. We accepted it as accurate and made our.
So you accepted the report as the evidence?
Yes.
You did not question or look at the underlying evidence that supports the conclusions in the report?
No.
Matt Zapotosky, the Attorney General, at best, on his heels there, but he started the day or went to bed last night, where he went to bed on his heels from the reporting that you and your colleagues did, and Mike Schmidt and his colleagues last night. Take us inside what you uncovered about that rift, some of which William Barr discussed today in his testimony.
Well, yeah, you heard Barr lay it out. I mean, so Mueller sends this letter, a remarkable thing for him to do to memorialize in writing his frustration with how Barr is characterizing his work. Today, Barr tried to spin it like, well, Mueller is upset about the press coverage, not the way I characterized Mueller's findings. But, you know, the press coverage was of the way he characterized Mueller's findings. And Mueller's letter doesn't say, I'm mad at the Washington Post or the New York Times for how they're reporting on you know, Barr's letter. It was sort of mad at how Barr was describing his work. This is a remarkable rift, though we're kind of in another interesting spot, right? Barr now offers this characterization today. Mueller is famously silent. Will he dispute that? Does he dispute that? Lindsey Graham suggested that he was open to hearing from Mueller and he would reach out on that question. But geez, the moment for him to dispute it, if he does, is now. And, so far he hasn't said anything. We've reached out to his people. I'm sort of expecting a no comment like we always do. We have a lot of Barr's account now. I wonder if and when we'll hear from Mueller.
Chuck, I'm going to put you on the spot. A source close to Robert Mueller told me last night when Matt and Mike's stories broke that he found it highly unlikely that the source or inspiration for Mueller's peak was media coverage, that it was far more likely, and we learned since the actual letters came out that what he was concerned about was the part of the letter that we read, that there was a distortion, and that the very purpose of a special counsel investigation was to take a probe out of the political arena, and in this administration and others, it couldn't be more partisan. So what do you think your friend Robert Mueller is thinking about all of the projection that William Barr has put on his thoughts, on the tone of his letters as snitty, on his job performance as incomplete? There are two sources in Mike Schmidt's story from last night that describe the state of mind of the sitting attorney general as being that they sort of viewed Mueller as not finishing the job, that his job was to either recommend charges or issue a declination letter. What do you think Mueller thinks about the piling on that's taking place?
So unlike the attorney general, Nicole, I read the report. And
you agree that he hasn't read it?
It seems that way. Either he didn't read it or he's not terribly conversant with it. Now, granted, he runs the United States Department of Justice, so busy guy. But how many investigations does he have of the president? I'm guessing not many.
Well,
more than usual.
I guess we don't know the answer.
Probably a non-zero number. But here's how I think Bob would think about it. He doesn't care about the press coverage. He's not at home, biting his nails, worried about what they might say about him on Fox or MSNBC or CNN. Doesn't care. What he cares about is that he spent 22 months with a team of professional agents and prosecutors and analysts trying to get to the truth. And then the truth was distorted. And it was distorted by the way his boss, the Attorney General, and let's be clear, Barr is absolutely his boss under the special counsel regs, presented it initially to the public. And that's got to be both disappointing and disheartening. And so the reason I think Bob Mueller wrote those letters, and we've talked about this, that seems remarkable, is because his work was mischaracterized. It wasn't that the press mischaracterized his work. The Attorney General mischaracterized his work, and that has to be very disappointing. And I think, in fact, I'm reasonably confident that's why he wrote those letters.
Have you heard from him?
Have I heard from Bob Mueller? No, nor do I expect to.
I know you have a very, very, very vast fan base that exceeds all of ours combined. So
I'm as a member of the media, I'm probably persona non grata.
I doubt that to be the case. Mike Schmidt, you have talked a lot and reported on what the special counsel investigation was sort of before Barr and what it became the moment Barr issued his 4-page summary of its ultimate conclusions, or whatever they want to call it. They debate, they like to quibble about what the definition of a summary is. But you've talked about the taint that it got, the moment that it was characterized by Barr, the moment that all we saw from the Mueller report were sentence fragments, not even a complete sentence. That seems to have only deteriorated from the time that you first reported some flashing yellow lights around that. Where does it stand right now?
Well, I think that the most important thing we have to remember about what Barr did is that it really set the narrative, and it was the sequencing. It was the sequencing of the report not being there for 4 weeks and allowing the president to go out and say he was exonerated based on that letter. And that was a powerful thing for the president, for the Republicans, because it allowed them to sort of slightly move past this and to allow the notion that nothing had gone wrong here to cement itself. And even though the report paints a different picture and Mueller's folks came to a different place than Barr did, it's fighting uphill. That part of the story is fighting uphill to try and break through because the idea that the Attorney General cleared the president is so powerful.
And it was allowed to sit a long enough time that Mueller was concerned by March 24th when he wrote his first letter, and March 27th, 3 days later. Do you have any idea what happened in those 3 days between Mueller's 3 letters? Did he feel ignored? Did he feel blown off? Did the press coverage get worse? What happened in those 3 letters between the 3 days between the 2 Mueller letters?
Well, I think there was a lot of frustration there, and I think that Mueller was not the only person on the team that felt that way. And I think he may have felt it more from underneath him than anything else, and that he may have been pushed, to do this. Look, I don't think he did anything he didn't want to do, but my guess is that he heard a lot about it, and that, that this frustration bubbled up certainly to his level. And, I think as Barr said today, he thought that the letter had been written by the team or by the folks underneath him. And, I don't know who wrote the letter, but you could easily sort of see that happening, and Mueller feeling that he was in a place and had to do that and had to memorialize that. And then there were these several conversations about this, and it did appear that Barr had no interest in putting out the summaries, that he wanted to wait to get the entire report out, and he didn't want to do it in piecemeal fashion.
Matt Miller, one of the criticisms of Attorney General Barr today was that he seemed to function more as a defense counsel for Donald Trump, and this was one of the exchanges where he appeared to do that, where he was defending the president's interactions with his White House counsel, Don McGahn. I think this was around an incident where he asked Don McGahn to push back against a story written by Mike and his colleagues, I believe, in the Times, about efforts to fire Special Counsel Mueller. Let's watch that.
You still have a situation where a president essentially tries to change the lawyer's account in order to prevent further criticism of himself.
Well, that's not a crime.
So you can, in this situation, instruct someone to lie?
No, it has to be, well, to be obstruction of justice, the lie has to be tied to impairing the evidence in a particular proceeding. McGahn had already given his evidence, and I think it would be plausible that the purpose of McGahn memorializing what the president was asking was to make the record that the president never directed him to fire. And there is a distinction between saying to someone, go fire him, go fire Mueller, and saying, have him removed based on conflict.
So this is not false. Here's what the Mueller report says. Chris Christie recalled a telephone conversation with the president in which the president asked what Christie thought about the president firing the special counsel. Christie advised against doing so because there was no basis for the president to fire the special counsel. This is from the Mueller report. The word fire is in there. And because the president would lose support from Republicans in the Congress if he did so. I mean, I think the headline in the section is around Donald Trump's efforts to fire the special counsel. What was that?
That was such an absurd answer. One of the ways to look at Barr's answers today, and this was true across the board, is every answer he was looking for, what is the thing that the president would want me to say? What is the thing that would most help the president? So you saw him giving the benefit of the doubt to the president in that answer and others that the department would never give to another defendant. You saw it, too, on the question about Paul Manafort and his conduct towards Paul Manafort when he said, oh, he wasn't just attacking flippers. He was saying that it's only flipping if you lie. That's what he didn't want you to do.
Aren't flippers usually liars who find religion?
Of course, that explanation again absurd on his face. You saw him, questioning the origins of the investigation, something the president has done, really from the beginning. You saw him, kind of twisting himself into a pretzel and refusing to condemn things that an attorney general would always condemn, like the president encouraging someone to lie, all because he wanted to defend the president. And to bring Mueller back into it, the question that I'm left with after watching the president today, we know now that the special counsel was really quite perturbed by the attorney general's letter on May 24th, so much that he there was a phone conversation, there were 2 letters that went back and forth. He was perturbed that he was misleading the American people. What has the AG done since then? He held a press conference where he doubled down to mislead the American people about why Mueller had made his obstruction decision the way he did. And then he did it today, saying this report showed that the president did nothing wrong on collusion. That's not at all what the report shows. It says they didn't establish evidence they didn't establish a crime was committed. It doesn't clear the president say he did nothing wrong. So If Mueller comes and testifies, if the Attorney General allows that to happen, he says he will, but they haven't agreed to a date yet, I wonder if Mueller comes in a little more forcefully because he thinks, I need to correct the record because the Attorney General continues to lie about what I said and what I did.
And for someone like Mueller to go in there and simply found, I mean, Chuck was sitting next to me, we're all up there, we flipped open and found this incident and found this right away. There were 5 witnesses that are quoted in here, and we don't know if there were others, that was precisely what the president sought to do, fire Special Counsel Mueller. We know that was under investigation for most of the course of the probe. Why would someone like Barr try to parse that out and lie about it today?
You know, I think that's what we're all struggling with. Why does someone who's been Attorney General in the past, who's had a really successful career, come in this late in the game and leave as his legacy the fact that he is now the man who has presented the best defense case Donald Trump can hope to get, right? I mean, that's what we all heard today. Mm-hmm. This was Trump's defense. And here's what I find so inexplicable. When Barr is discussing the decision that he made, you know, I looked at all of the stuff that was in the report and decided that there wasn't sufficient evidence to file an obstruction charge. And when I did that, I took everything that was in the report as true. I used that evidence at face value, even when I disagreed with it. But here we have him contradicting himself, and when he discusses this incident, he's saying, I don't agree with the evidence in the Mueller report, and these 5 witnesses, you can throw out their testimony, and the president really wasn't trying to fire him to end the investigation. So there are contradictions, there are lies. It's a mystifying performance.
Can I just say this one thing, just because this is a conversation that Joyce and I have had. It's a conversation Matt and I have had. Chuck and I haven't had it yet, but I'm sure we will. And Jim Comey's got an op-ed piece in the New York Times that dropped today on this question. It's been this, we've all been discussing it because people of goodwill across the political and ideological spectrum coming into this all said about Bill Barr, well, we got some questions. The job application memo is problematic. Some of the things he said in his confirmation testimony is problematic, but ultimately maybe he's going to be an institutionalist. And the question of why, what has turned him into, because today's performance has been of a piece with everything he's done since the Mueller report came in. Everything he's done has been pure political hackery and filled with lies, filled with misrepresentations. Now I think there are cases we can point to that will be, people will say, are perjury, that he should be, that's grounds now for impeachment. Certainly many Democrats calling for resignation. All of this has been consistent. So we've asked the question over and again, what happens to a man? What happens to a person with his reputation? What does Donald Trump do to these people's souls? I think it's a really interesting question, and I don't care anymore because it's not someone will write a great book about this someday, and maybe we'll understand how it is that Donald Trump Comey addresses this today, how he chips away at people's souls, how he eats them whole, how he turns them into these zombies, these Trumpified zombies who go forward and do his work, leaving all of their reputation, their stature, and their former any former ethical standing they had behind. In the end, though, it's not relevant because what we have now is an attorney general who has presented himself in a way that's not really refutable anymore. He is fully, obviously corrupted, and everything that comes out of his mouth over the course of the last month has demonstrated that he is not acting as the Attorney General of the United States anymore. He is only acting as a paid, fully bought and paid member of Donald Trump's political team. And I think we have to see everything that comes out of his mouth from this point forward through that prism. It's the only conclusion we can draw. And, you know, motives, we'll figure them out later, maybe, but they're not relevant.
Before we lose Matt and Mike, I follow a lot of your colleagues on Twitter. I was trying to follow your analysis as the day went on. Let me start with you, Matt. Where did you see this day ending up? What are you writing today? What are we going to see breaking when we get off the air and look at our phones? And what do you expect to happen tomorrow?
Well, I don't know about tomorrow. I mean, I still think when I walked in here, it was still up in the air as to whether he would even be there. I would be surprised, though, if the House doesn't want their shot now at Barr while the iron is hot. Look, I think it was a pretty remarkable event. We learned for the first time Barr's on the record kind of side of this dispute with Mueller. He aired it out in great detail, including the sort of epic detail of him calling Mueller and saying, man, why didn't you call me? Why'd you put this thing in writing? Which I thought was particularly noteworthy. And we heard, as a lot of your other guests have talked about today, Barr operating as like a person who gives Trump the benefit of the doubt in all situations. I mean, when he was going through these obstruction episodes, I was kind of stunned. For a defense attorney to say that, absolutely. You know, I could see someone trying to defend their client saying, well, look at it this way, favorable to him, look at it this way. But Barr is now kind of like the chief prosecutor of the United States, and he wasn't talking like a prosecutor. Every set of facts he viewed in a way that was favorable to Trump, including, I think a lot of people have said, well, he's shading the facts, but he sort of out and out said, President Trump could fire Mueller, and that wouldn't be obstruction because President Trump was essentially falsely accused. So he'd be shutting down like a wrong-headed investigation that was ruining the country. That's a pretty remarkable thing to say for the Attorney General of the United States, a remarkably undercutting thing probably for Mueller's folks, and you can see why that tension is there. So still a lot to digest. It just wrapped up before I walked in here, but a remarkable day overall.
Mike Schmidt, same question to you. And Barr did what Matt just described. He also played the role of media critic, and I think calling into question some of the incidents that you and your colleagues have covered, things that Mueller also dove into and seemed to corroborate in the report. So any thoughts about what you saw today and what you think happens next?
Yeah, on that stuff, I would just urge people to look at what Mueller said in his report, and it doesn't necessarily line up with what Barr said. I think that Barr's candor today was pretty interesting, how he spoke repeatedly about how he did not understand Bob Mueller's rationale. He spoke, negatively about the letter. He implied that it may have been written by his staffers. Those are not complimentary things to say about someone. And I don't understand what the calculus is there. Is the calculus to follow through on what the president would want? Does he think that politically this is the best way to deal with this problem? Does he feel that the president was so wronged by the Russia investigation and the cloud it had over his administration that he deserves this to try to balance things out? I just would love to know what is driving this, because it is quite powerful and quite directed.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.